million price tag to tear this building down because of the asbestos tile. It's all gone friable now, and all of the other things that are in it, lead-based paint. The boat picture there, by the way, is the interior courtyard where they used to park cars. There are 8-inch trees growing up out of the pavement there. So it's really tough. It's blight as you've never seen it before, and it's, again, part of the problem, and hopefully will be taken care of to make a solution for it. Current project is Walter Reed Army Medical Center. This is the historic hospital on 110 acres in northwestern D.C. In a realignment, they took 5,600 jobs from the District of Columbia and moved them across into Virginia, into Maryland. Moved to hospital functions and research functions. The reuse plan, again, through a very, very public process that rivals that you've gone through here in Fort Ord, calls for a $1 billion new urban type of a project. End up with about 3 million square feet, 2,000 homes, but there's also 600,000 square feet of historic property that's there that needs to be taken care of and needs to remain all this time as well. The EDC negotiations that are in place, and what the LRA, which is the District of Columbia, decided to do here was to, instead of putting their own money up, they are teaming with a private developer, and they just selected a group led by Hines and Urban Development as the master developer for this project, and in negotiations for that. But it's tough. Talk about blight. That big building you see on the lower right-hand side, that's the main central hospital, which is a 2.6 million square foot facility built in 1971 of post-stress concrete in the brutalist style. It needs to come down. It's going to cost $40 million by my engineering experts to take that building down. There is also the reuse plan, which you see here in concept form, also calls for a net zero energy goal in the next 15 years, which means a whole new set of infrastructure has to go into the ground to support a central cooling and heating plant. So a lot of overhead and baggage on this project, but on the other hand, being in Washington, everyone thinks, ooh, great market, Washington's great. Well, this is Northwest Washington. This is about 6 miles from downtown. It's not near a transit station, a metro station, so it's got some issues with that. And right now, the question we're dealing with the Army is the value of the property. They have what I believe is a very inflated sense of value for the land underneath it, given the cost to do it. But on the other hand, it's going to cost a lot of money to do that. Lastly, and I'll just be brief on this one, is Niagara Army Reserve. It's a tiny little base. This is about a 19-acre facility next to an airport up in the town of Niagara, which is not Niagara Falls, but right next to it. 160,000 square feet of industrial space. Great spot, even though it's the Rust Belt, there's not a lot going on. The space for $2 or $3 a square foot rent could be rented out pretty quickly. And we've actually had tenants come along that were ready to go in there, but for 3 years we have not been able to transfer the property. And the reason is the bureaucratic bungling that goes on the part of the seller of the property, being the U.S. government, and a tiny environmental issue, which is has hung it up. One little corner of the property, they found some traces potentially of PCB. And as soon as they found that, they said, oh, that's no problem. We can just write some, we'll put a deed restriction in there that just says you can't go out and dig in that area, no problem. Or if you do go out in that pipe, you have to dress up in Kevlar suits and stuff. And the LRA director, who's the town supervisor, looked at him and said, do you know where we are right now here in Niagara? Yeah, we're in Niagara. No, you're 4 miles from Love Canal. The minute that information gets out that there's even a hint of an environmental issue with that site, we'll never, ever lease, sell, or do anything with this property again. So, Army, you've got to clean it up and solve that problem. And so we've been going through that, and just last week we got a call from the Army saying, I know it's been 2 years or 3 years, but we're going to be another year away because we think the science was wrong and there really isn't a problem, but it's going to take us a year to reissue the environmental documents that we have to put together to show that there is no problem after all. So, these are the things that happen in the BRAC world. So, what are the common themes? The 4 common themes. Market forces. Pease, good location. Although it went through several cycles, some ups and downs, it's had a strong market because location is important. Chanute, best I can say, is locationally challenged. Here it is, is a contaminated property in the middle of farmland, all of which is available, dirt cheap, with utilities right around this. The greenfields spaces compete dramatically and cannot support any kind of additional cost going into redevelopment. Walter Reed, again, the location isn't proven yet since it's not on the metro, but we're talking about a 15 to 20-year build-out plan. So the net present value, after you account for all the upfront costs and the revenues that ultimately come in my mind, isn't all that high. And Niagara, there's a market. We could get people, jobs created in that thing tomorrow on a smaller scale if we could get hold of the property. So, funding. Pease, again, going back to the organization and the political structure, here you had squabbling local communities without any money in their own pocket wanting control. The state stepped in and put up some money, put a GO bond for $50 million, got some good EDA grants in, luckily, and some revenue bonds to get the process started and to finally get the private investment that came in. Chanute, again, there was no cash flow, and it's been bootstrap all the way. And as it is, it's going to continue even after they get hold of the property. Walter Reed has gone the route of getting private investment up front in a master developer. And hopefully, but there's still huge upfront costs that have to be satisfied first. In Niagara, small property, the town was willing to buy it at the price it was offered once they could get a title to it. Expertise, I mentioned Pease, but it was the first one out of the gate. So everybody was learning as they went. And so there was no wrong way of doing it. Today, when you've had all this experience behind you, there's lots of people that know great ways how not to do it and how to stop a process as opposed to having it move forward. Walter Reed is a very strong LRA. It's a District of Columbia itself, a little political, but they have a good team of professionals working on it. And they're benefiting from the experience from both sides. The Army, at this case, has gone through enough of these that they're able to now facilitate some of these transfers a little bit better. Environmental, Air Force bases have their issues, but again, it was taken under a public benefit conveyance, and that made the environmental a lot easier. Chanute, huge issues, and they're going to continue to drive ahead at a snail's pace in terms of the actual transfer and redevelopment. Walter Reed doesn't have too many problems, but it's demolition and the cost that goes along with that, because environmental adds costs. And in Niagara, the PCB issue was dealt with, but again, it's getting the bureaucratic environmental process to move at a speed that will keep up with the marketplace, which is often very difficult. Again, to sum it up, large development sites, anyway, any development site is complex. And with complexity, what you need is knowledgeable players from all aspects of it, from the technical aspects as well as the real estate aspects of it and the political aspects. You need patience, as you've seen and exhibited here at Fort Ord, because it's going to take a long time, and you need adequate financial resources. Size of the property isn't necessarily an indicator of complexity. Strong market demand will solve a lot of problems, and it has solved a lot of problems. There are some bases that are completely redeveloped today, like Pease, like Glenview, and some of the others, because they timed it. The timing was right in that the private sector stepped in because there was money to be made. And the last point that came across from looking at all these bases is that turnover of personnel, both at the local side, in the political structure, as well as in the staff structure, and more importantly, on the military side, where they have shorter stints, and once that institutional memory is gone, you've got to re-educate all over again. That's a big problem as well. So, cash flow, cash flow, cash flow, cash flow. And I'm seeing today is, and you've heard about it already, and we'll hear more about it, is this increased reliance on future sources of future tax revenue primarily to fund the infrastructure, to fund these things that the private sector can't do up front. There's a question out here among economic developers as to how sustainable that truly is. Because when you're taking future tax revenues from it to fund this project, you're also taking away from other projects that might depend on those in the future. So it's a balancing act. And lastly, private sector partners. And what I want to say on that is that the issue is that there are radically different concepts of what return on investment is and the timing of that return on investment between a private investor and a public investor representing the communities that are redeveloping projects. Developers need their money back in a short period of time, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years. We're thinking 20 years, and being able to take those two time frames and move them together on these projects has been the really hardest issue that I've seen dealt with. And I'll leave you with one thought, and as coming from the real estate world, what is economic development? It's a creation of jobs. It's a creation of value in real estate, adding value to real estate. What that takes, though, it's not government adding jobs. It is private sector investors going in, investing their hard, cold cash, and creating value. And to do that, you need to have that private investor. So all of this redevelopment, all of the planning we do, all of the forward thinking that we can do, needs to keep in mind that ultimately you have to have someone taking money out of their pocket, a private individual or group of individuals, putting their cash on the line and expecting a rate of return on that. That's central to any economic development. There's a real estate deal behind every job that's created, and that has to be kept first and foremost as we move forward. So with that, I'll end and turn it over to Jim.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I just want to say I think this is a really great idea to have this colloquium. And as been mentioned earlier today, there is a real need for regional collaboration to take on a project of this scale and this number of challenges. And it's really terrific to see CUSUMB stepping up and taking a leadership role in this and really engaging it. And I think it's a timely time because the CSUMB is really gaining traction and getting scale, and the expansions that you're planning with the faculty and the research you're doing, I think are all going to be really, really helpful to that. I've titled my little presentation here, The Economics of Blight Removal and Redevelopment, because I want to make the point that you can't really think about blight removal in and of itself. It's really part and parcel of a much bigger set of challenges that are very much interrelated, and I want to talk about how those are connected. First, I want to give just a little bit of background about what we do, so give you some context for my remarks. My company, Economic Planning Systems, is a real estate economics consulting firm. I will confess, though, that I do have a planning degree, although arguably not a practicing planner. I think urban economics is really kind of a stepchild of planning in many ways, but it really has to do with all the economic dimensions of land use and development, redevelopment. But our work, and this is a list, I'm not going to bore you with pictures of all these, but there's some points I want to make about this. But we, as real estate economists, have been involved in base reuses all over the country since the beginning of the RAC process. And this is a list of some of the projects that we've worked on. Our job goes everything from working with people like Peter Katz was mentioning early on in the programming of those uses to try to make sure that the economics actually fit with the plan so that they don't get abandoned and they actually can be implemented. I'm a charter member of the New Urbanism myself and have worked with a lot of people that Peter is referring to over the years on these kinds of projects as well as others. We also do the financial feasibility, the cash flow stuff Craig was mentioning, developer solicitation, negotiations, helping to ink the deals between the private sector and the public sector on these public-private deals. So having worked on a lot of these different bases, I think we've seen the good, bad, and the ugly, the successes, the failures, and the challenges in all kinds of different settings. There's a couple of points I want to make from this list. I know that just from, we've been involved in Fort Ord for a long time, going back originally to the MBEST Center, and as somebody mentioned earlier, it hasn't achieved its potential. I still hold out hope that it will. I think that UCSC does have a role to play down here, and I think with CUSMB maybe taking the lead down here, that could become an academic partner and maybe be revivified and then achieve some of its original purposes to bring together some of the intellectual resources of the region. But we've also been here trying to work out some of the challenges on financing this very large, very challenging base. But I wanted to just mention, I know that there's been a lot of frustration in this region, some of it directed at FORA and some of it just general, about how long it takes and how seemingly little progress is being made. But if you look at this list of bases here, all of them have been closed and in progress for 20 years or more in many cases. Many of them are in very strong urban markets and still are struggling to succeed. I can list the ones on here who have succeeded. I'll start with the Presidio. One of the people who was responsible here for the Presidio's success, Jim Meadows, is here as a speaker. But the Presidio is really almost in a different class. It is in a different class all by itself. First of all, it's a national park. Second of all, it was endowed with $20 million a year of federal funding for the first 15 or 20 years. And in order to become self-sufficient, it also sits on some of the most valuable real estate on the planet. It also has its separate sovereign land use control from the city of San Francisco, which is probably the thing that saved it more than anything else. So it is doing very well, and for a lot of different reasons, but it's almost shouldn't be even considered in the same breath. Fitzsimmons Army Medical Center in Denver is actually a really good example of where a kind of catalytic use with a university made all the difference. When we first started working on that, the University of Colorado Medical Center was involved. They were very reluctant to actually move any facilities there. They expected it was going to be a 20, 30-year program. And then they got a grant for a major cancer research center that went to Fitzsimmons, and within 5 years, it was the place to be, and everybody moved in there in very short order, and it is really, really successful as a result. Lowry Air Force Base, another product of Jim Meadows, is another successful project, but again, in a really strong market, really significant opportunities for residential and other development there. Peter Katz mentioned earlier, I can't remember the name of the project now, but the Naval Training Center Orlando was one of the projects he pointed out, and I was involved with one of the other planners that didn't get selected, but we did a whole plan for it. Again, right there next to Winter Park in the middle of Orlando, incredible location, and it's been successful. The one that's probably the most comparable, but on a much smaller scale to Fort Ord, is the Fleet Industrial Supply Center in Alameda, which is a relatively small piece of the naval facilities that are there, redeveloped by Catellis, all for residential in a very constrained residential market. They had similar demolition problems. They had old World War II era barracks that were contaminated with lead paint and asbestos. In addition to that, they were contaminated with cordane, because young sailors were told to apply pesticides to the foundations, and they did it in bucketfuls, evidently. So it was very expensive demolition, but the economics of that deal drove that change very quickly. But everything else on this list is still no further along, really, than Fort Ord is. And that includes Treasure Island in San Francisco, right in the middle of San Francisco Bay, Hunters Point, also in San Francisco, the Alameda Naval Air Station, which is, also prime real estate that Jennifer Ott talked about earlier. And the fact is that it just takes a long time to overcome the hurdles to development, even when you have strong market fundamentals and political support and other things. So I would just encourage people not to get too discouraged, and also remember that the economic conditions that we've had in the last 5 years have been very daunting everywhere. In terms of blight, blight is only one of the challenges, and I'll talk a little bit about what some of the other challenges are. But Fort Ord has an extraordinary amount of blighted building property. And it's really a shame that it's standing the way it is. And the fact is that a lot of these old barracks, they are very difficult to reuse. They have very limited reuse potential. The military, or the federal government, has always taken the position that, lead paint and asbestos is okay, because if you don't disturb it, it's not going to be a problem. But the fact is that these things are moldering away, they're falling apart, they are really a hazard, and it's really quite unfortunate that the federal government left this to the local agencies to deal with in such a scale that they have. And maybe someday that there'll be a basis for trying to find some solutions that bring in some money from outside. So blight does not exist on its own. All of these bases that we've looked at have a common set of challenges. Environmental contamination of all kinds. There's all sorts of solvents and hydrocarbons and various other things. Fort Ord has the unique asset of unexploded ordnance on top of that. And anybody hear that rumbling earlier this morning? I was watching the news this morning, and they said there were going to be exploding ordnance out here today. And in fact, I heard one going off earlier this morning. But I once got an unintentional laugh at a conference down here when I was on a panel with somebody from the Zurich insurance company. And during my talk, I mentioned that developers were having a hard time getting comfortable with unexploded ordnance. And she thought that was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. So there's a lot of contamination here. And because of NEPA, the Army is cleaning up a lot of this. They did a good job of conveying the property early, so that was good on them. But they did leave an awful lot of moldering buildings to deal with. The demolition of these buildings is costly. Knocking down these old wood structures is no big deal. The disposition of lead-based paint and asbestos it's very costly. It's hard for development to support that by itself. In addition to that, there's a lot of infrastructure that's needed for these bases. This is 18,000 acres. No, it's more than that. 28,000. This is a very, very, very large property. And granted, not all is going to be developed, but you can't serve it all with small interior streets. It has to have some major travel routes, sewer, water, infrastructure, things of that nature also have to be developed, and that adds to the challenge. Market support for new uses. This is I thought the Bill Colloquium's comments this morning were really one of the most cogent commentaries or statements about kind of the conditions I think that you face in Monterey County that I've heard. And the fact is you have a very, very large base in a market that is primarily agriculture and tourism driven. It's a giant redevelopment project to drive with a relatively limited economic base. And I think what Bill was suggesting about kind of how do you tap into the real assets of this region and build up organically are very important points and then should be followed. Multiple political constituencies agendas. Again, all bases have these. Fort Ord's got more than its share with 8 cities. A lack of institutional capacity to carry out redevelopment. This happens so often you cannot believe it. Alameda, for example, was a fully built out little town, mostly Victorians, about 70,000 people, and the base represented 1/3 of its entire land area. The city had really no experience processing development since they were built out city, and suddenly faced with a very, very significant redevelopment project. They didn't have the kind of staff and internal in-house expertise to do that, and had to work to develop it. Capital, I think as Craig said, cash flow, cash flow, cash flow. It takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of upfront money to change these conditions. And all of it ultimately is driven by the market and by development. And if that development is weak or if it goes on hold because of economic conditions, it's very difficult to move forward. Private sector financial feasibility is at the heart of all of this. And all of these projects, it's harder than it is on non-reused property because you have additional extraordinary costs that have to be borne by the development in some form. So that's for everybody. Everybody faces some measure of this. What's specific about Fort Ord? First of all, it has all of the above challenges. And in addition to that, it has its own unique characteristics. As I mentioned, this is a really extraordinarily large base in a relatively non-urban, small labor force kind of economy that just makes it harder. There's that equation between economic power and market forces and the size of the challenge and the costs that need to be borne are very difficult to overcome. The effects of the Great Recession, I just mentioned this in passing, but this is something that has been a devastating recession everywhere in the country, top to bottom, even major markets everywhere. And in California even, we have a boom going on in San Francisco. That boom doesn't go very far into the East Bay. If you go into the Alameda and Contra Costa counties, they're not booming, not yet. Certainly not the Central Valley, and many other parts of California aren't experiencing that same kind of economic rebound. Nationally, we have a very anemic recovery in terms of employment, and that's going to take a long time to do. Back to the scale of this, I want to just make a point that one of the I think precepts of reuse here was that to replace the 18,000 jobs that were lost when this base closed. But you have to remember that 18,000 jobs were here because Uncle Sam drafted them and sent them here. So it wasn't because they were here to participate in a very robust and deep economy. So that's probably not a realistic number to be aiming towards. It isn't to say that there shouldn't be every effort made to create as much jobs as possible. But some of the things that we talked about earlier, building on the indigenous capabilities of the region, whether they be agricultural and tourism, quality of life, and those kinds of things, or the innovation spin-offs from the universities, don't necessarily have to produce that many jobs to be successful. And it's going to take a while, but that's a really perhaps overstated goal. Water supply. Everybody knows Monterey and Santa Cruz County are not part of the state water system, and they have a very constrained access to water supply, and that is a fairly significant issue, both in terms of just allocating it in the process of getting the water that's needed for development and the constraints it puts on development overall. The jurisdiction I mentioned earlier with 8 cities and a county, this is one reason why it's really, really important to have regional perspective on this. And FORA, as an entity that embodies and represents all those jurisdictions, but has a central focused role on trying to do the redevelopment here, is something, if it's not FORA, something very much like FORA, has got to be in place to handle something that has this much jurisdictional diversity to it. FORA is intended to be sunset, and it says 2017, but it's actually 2020. And 2020 is not very far away. We're going to be there in about 6 years. And I think we can look forward to some better economic times in the next 6 years than we have in the last 5, for sure. But I would be very surprised if the job is done in that amount of time. And I think it's not too early to start thinking about how to empower FORA, how to extend it, how to replace it with another organization that has similar capabilities and responsibilities, and how to enhance its funding potentials so that it can take on some of these challenging blight removal and redevelopment processes. One of the things that makes this so hard here is that everything, the financing structure that's been set up here is highly dependent on development. Primarily it's land sales, tax increment, and fees. And that depends on actual taxable uses being developed, and developers coming in with private capital being willing to put up that money and to create things that generate tax revenues. So as soon as the market goes down, the financing faucet dries up. And that's difficult. And Jennifer Ott mentioned earlier the lease revenues they get from Alameda, which have been very sustaining and help them to kind of continue on their efforts in redevelopment in other areas. And the reuse potential on the buildings in Fort Ord are very, very limited. And fortunately, some of them have been reusable for CSUMB, but there's not a lot of money laying around out there on leasing these buildings. They're just not suitable, they're not flexible, they're not adaptable enough, and they're really in really poor condition right now. That all feeds into this whole, public-private partnerships is really what this is all about. You got to get private capital enhanced by and enabled by and matched by, in some cases, or at least supplemented by public financing. And it really does ultimately depend on having market-driven development potential. So what kind of strategies might be appropriate here? First of all, as I mentioned, it's not too early to start thinking about how to continue to work at this in a joint fashion with all the jurisdictions that are involved. And whether it's an extension of FORA through legislation, or the creation of a new joint powers authority, or something of that nature. Maybe there's even a room for a JPA in addition to 4 that helps to raise money in a different way to contribute to it. But there needs to be a look to see what can be done. If there's any way to bring in money that isn't so completely dependent on development, knowing that development, really the best development you have that's going to be most enhancing to the quality of life down here, that makes the most sense based on the fundamentals of this place, this economy, is going to be organic. It's going to be smaller scale. It's going to take time, and it's not going to be big scale development. It's going to drive a lot of money. So, creating some additional financing mechanisms. I don't know if all of you from other parts of the country know that Jerry Brown, in his infinite wisdom, abolished redevelopment in California 2 years ago, which is highly ironic given the fact that when he was the mayor of Oakland, he did great things with redevelopment in downtown Oakland that really made a difference. But we don't have, if FORA lapses and its tax increment capacity lapses, there is no mechanism in place really to replace it for using tax revenues that are generated by development for investment in the property. There is what the IFD was called an infrastructure financing district, which is a tax increment mechanism, but it's been around for a long time. It's never been used because you can only use your own money, and redevelopment allows you to use money from other taxing entities. However, there's a lot of legislation pending to make that a more robust financing mechanism. There is the ability for entities, the county and other jurisdictions to enter in voluntarily to put their money in, and that might be something that would be worth pursuing as well. And my favorite source of money, exogenous money. It's a really tough time to be going to the federal government or anybody else looking for money right now, but given the time frame that these things take, that may change. And the obvious challenge that's been left by the federal government here with all these dilapidated buildings is only going to get worse and more obvious, and maybe there will be an opportunity at some point to do that. CSUMB has successfully, as they announced earlier, gotten $30 million to take down buildings on the campus, and that's a tremendous thing. It's going to remove a lot of some of the things that are on the base that should be gone, but also might be a good precedent to show that this really can't happen without some money that comes in from outside. You can always go to looking at other things such as voter-approved bonds for very selected purposes. Part of the problem that they have here is that some of this blight is located at really key locations. People see it on the freeway, they see it at important entrances to the base, and maybe on a more surgical basis there would be some support for a little bit of extra taxation with voter approval to excise some of that to kind of help prime the pump. It's not an easy thing to do, but it could happen. Partner with CSUMB. I think there's been a lot of talk here. I think that there's some real potential and some real intent here. Mr. Ochoa has, I think, made a very eloquent statement about the interest in the university being involved in that. And it's terrific to have a partner like that. And I think that the better and bigger and stronger that they become, the more of an anchor and the more of a presence they'll be here. And it's going to be beneficial in its own right, but to the extent that it's being pursued in a proactive way, I think it could be a really very powerful partnership. So that's something that everybody should work towards. This $30 million of blight removal, I'm sure it will all go to needs that you have. Maybe there's some way that through contracting, if there's some efficiencies that maybe FORA has some money that they can put into the pot to chip away at some of the edges of some of the things that they could do by having a more efficient contracting around the work that you're doing on the campus. That might be something that's worth exploring, just to kind of leverage and make better use of the more limited resources that FORA has for that purpose. Again, I'm thinking maybe that the CSUMB's success here with the state in better financial condition, maybe there's a precedent there that maybe it's on a limited and identified basis to go and seek some of this money from the state as well. Nobody's really talked much about the National Monument today. I know that this has been done, and it's one more thing that kind of enhances and reinforces the quality of life and environmental character down here. and something else to build on from the visitor and tourist standpoint, and to the extent that that can somehow be used as a tool to help to express the potentials of Fort Ord, it should be pursued. And last of all, placemaking. This is a very, very large place, 8 different cities that each have their own constituencies and their own goals and objectives. But it is worthwhile to step back and think about the sub-region and the location as a place in itself. And to the extent that through fora, of which all the jurisdictions are members, priorities can be set that really help to build and define that place in a way. That's something that could really help. And the more that it emerges, the more it is expressed on the ground, it becomes a form of momentum that would be a benefit to everybody. So with that, I'm going to pass it off. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Next is Lenny Siegel, Executive Director for the Center for Public Environmental Oversight.
Good afternoon. Jim mentioned unexploded ordnance, and I'm going to be talking about a method that the Defense Department has developed to find and remove unexploded ordnance from underground, not just better, but what we say, cheaper, safer, faster, and better. It's not clear how much of this can be done at Fort Ord at this point. A lot of the land has been cleared. The decision has been made not to clear. I always advocated for subsurface clearance throughout the post, and perhaps at some point that decision might be revisited. The challenge of munitions response, the removal of unexploded ordnance, is you have here a lot of land that people were just waiting to use, largely for recreational use, but for other uses as well. These are lands that were used for military training and thus have lots of ordnance on the surface and underneath. You also have a sensitive ecosystem, not just here, but throughout the country, where the process of digging holes to remove unexploded ordnance can be destructive to the ecosystem. I've heard this from the pine barrens of Massachusetts and the deserts, the prairies, the tundra. The only place where it doesn't seem to be a problem are the temperate forests of the state of Washington, which seem to grow back rather quickly. And then the key thing about munitions is that if there's a problem, it's catastrophic. It's not just there's a chance that somebody's cancer might have been caused by an exposure way back when. You know what caused it. They get blown up. Fortunately, that only seems to happen in most cases when people tamper with it, but then you don't want to take the chance that kids who don't know any better, despite the education they get, will be tampering with the ordnance. This is just what's being done. This is the standard way to keep people off the land. It's largely effective, but in the long run, it's not enough to rely upon. In my view, the goal of munitions response is to prevent exposure to unexploded ordnance. I've been part of Army-sponsored teams that try to do risk assessment, say what is the chance of something blowing up, and if it blows up, how much will it hurt you? The goal, which I hear from people who've found ordnance in their backyard, you don't want your kids to come across unexploded ordnance. And you want to minimize disruption to the community and destruction to the land. One of the reasons that I've argued for more subsurface clearance is that munitions tend to become uncovered. These aren't the rocks or munitions in New England where the freeze-thaw cycle pushes them to the surface. But in virtually every environment, there's some natural process that bring munitions to the surface. Here, largely that would be erosion. And so just because something is buried now doesn't mean it will be buried forever. And of course, if there's actually construction, people putting up fences, all kinds of things can bring people into contact with ordnance in a way that they shouldn't be. So again, I advocate maximization of subsurface clearance. The record of decision for the major impact area calls for a relatively small percentage of the land being cleared into subsurface. I'd like to see more, but it's my understanding from the Army that about 100 acres of land slated for subsurface clearance in the former impact area still hasn't been done. The historic approach to clearing unexploded ordnance is first you clear the land, and that's been fairly controversial around here because of problems with some of the fires in the early days. Once you've cleared the surface of the land, you clear of the vegetation, then you pick up not only munitions but other metal that might be lying on the surface. Then you use either magnetometer, which is a passive device, or electromagnetic induction device, otherwise known as a coin detector, to detect subsurface metal. And under the historic approach, basically when it beeps, you put a flag in the ground, or more recently you make a mark with your GPS, and you come back and you dig every time you found metal. And then you remove the metal, or you look at it, you say, this isn't ordnance, I'm not worried, or you decide it's ordnance, and you either blow it in place, or if it's safe to move, you may move it to another location where you'll blow them up together. The problem with this conventional approach, even using the most modern technologies and the best trained people, is you often end up digging hundreds of holes per acre and only finding a few pieces of ordnance. What's the problem with that? Well, it's costly. You're spending a lot of money digging holes, dry holes. It's time consuming. Obviously, you're digging holes that you don't need to dig. It also leads to closing off areas, whether it's recreational use or schools nearby or businesses nearby, even some places they evacuate homes. Because any time you're digging these holes, you have to make sure people are outside the explosive arc. Because if something goes wrong, it's bad enough that the people doing the work are in danger, other people may be in danger as well. As I said earlier, digging hundreds of holes per acre can damage the landscape, and in many cases, such as chaparral, it takes a long time for the natural ecosystem to grow back. And finally, when you have people digging holes, hundreds of holes, and only a few of them are at risk, they're likely to let their guard down. Oh, this is probably another piece of metal or a horseshoe, don't worry about it. And they aren't as careful as they might be if they knew there was a greater chance that they were actually digging something explosive. The new method is called geophysical classification. And the basic idea is you want to decide before you dig whether it's likely that the piece of metal that's under the surface is likely to be a piece of ordnance. So you may still clear the land of surface metal and or at least the vegetation. But what you do is you start out the same way. You use a metal detector and you identify where there's metal and you mark it on your digital map. And then you come back, they call it with a cued survey, where you park a piece of equipment above the metal and you get more data, more signals. I'll come back to that in a minute, to help you determine whether what's buried is actually a piece of munition or looks like a piece of ordnance. You create a dig list. You decide what to dig. And usually that's not only the things that you're sure are ordnance, but the things that you aren't sure about, but you can't say definitely are not. And then, again, you dig those pieces and you blow them up. But you may leave other metal in the ground. You may leave the horseshoes and nails and all the other stuff that's out there in the ground because you're convinced, and the demonstrations of this technology are very persuasive, you're convinced that these are not potentially explosive. Now, there are some places like the island of Kaho'olawe on Hawaii where the Kaho'olawe Commission said, we don't just want to remove ordnance, we want to remove all anthropogenic metal from this natural site. There's a Pueblo Indian reservation in New Mexico, where the tribe is concerned about the threat of sharp fragmented metal to their cattle, and they want that removed. But by and large, the idea in most places is you want to eliminate the explosive risk and not worry about the little coil of barbed wire or horseshoe that might be there from past use of the land. Important thing to, and I didn't include this in my PowerPoint, but I think just in terms of people's safety concerns, this doesn't mean that the old method, the mag and flag, or just even the electromagnetic induction, it doesn't mean that when you've cleared it that way that it's unsafe. It means it's been inefficient. Because I visited Camp Butner in North Carolina where they've been demonstrating this technology, and I met an old-timer there whose land had been cleared the old way, and he seemed excited about the new way, that he wanted his land cleared again with the new way. And I had to point out to him, that's not going to make any difference. They've already cleared your land. The idea is they had to dig a lot of extra holes when they did it. So again, the fact that this new technology is available doesn't mean that the old technology is leaving people at risk. Typical device that's used to do this kind of survey, electromagnetic survey, is a metal, this is called the metal mapper, and it consists of 3 sets of coils in 3 dimensions. So that instead of the 1 coil that you see in a metal detector, it's 2, a transmitter and receiver coil, you have 3 sets of that. And it can be pulled with a tractor, or actually this would be pushed with a tractor. It can be pulled or pushed by people, be carried across the land in many different ways. But the key thing is it has 3 coils that can map the electromagnetic signals in 3 dimensions. So, and this is going to be simplistic because it's actually, trained geophysicists do more than I'm going to tell you right now, but this is something that's easy for us lay people to understand, is you basically get 3 decay curves from this device. And basically, a cylinder has these 2 curves at the bottom together and 1 above it. That indicates something that could be a cylinder. And now that could be a can of soda, and you'd have to treat the can of soda as an artillery shell. But anything cylindrical is going to show up with that pattern, whereas the horseshoe, which is flat, shows up with the other pattern. And that's a simple way that this technology works. They also compare the signals they receive to a library of signals from past surveillance of the land. But what this allows you to do, obviously, is to discriminate or classify objects based on the electromagnetic signals from a device that in 1 dimension that only detects metal, and this helps you see what it looks like. And then, once they've done that, they develop a dig list. And the important thing here to understand is you just have red, yellow, and green. And the red says, oh, this is definitely ordnance. Yellow is we aren't sure, and green, don't worry about it. The key thing in this process and why it's been so successful is if it's yellow, they're unable to classify it, they say dig it anyhow. That is, they still err on the side of caution. So it's not as you get a bunch of static and you don't know what to do. If you don't know what to do, you dig it up the old way anyhow. This technology has been demonstrated successfully throughout the country. I believe the first site was former Camp Seibert in Alabama, because the land was farmland, it was flat and clear. And gradually they've used places like Camp Bill, which is wooded, and gone to many parts of the country and found that this works better than they expected. They don't find, when they go back and dig everything, they don't find that they've missed any ordnance. If the old technology was going to find something, they find it with geophysical classification. They just have to dig a lot fewer holes. We're at a key point, however, where this is still a demonstration technology sponsored by the Defense Department's Environmental Security Technological Certification Program. And the trick right now is to get the Army and the other armed services to implement it on a production scale, on a full scale. And this is something that might be done for portions of Fort Ord. And I think it should be considered as a way of more efficiently removing ordnance in a way that's less destructive to the landscape and less disruptive to the people who live nearby. Now, this is not a magic bullet. It doesn't work in all terrains. It doesn't work if the vegetation is too dense. The equipment, the metal mapper I showed you, is still fragile. They don't make enough of them that they've figured out how to harden them so it breaks down. There are places where there's too much clutter, too much metal in the ground. And there's too much metal,